Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Catherine Patterson, and I'm the co-executive director of CityHealth, along with my counterpart, Katrina Forrest, who you'll hear from in just a bit. This week, CityHealth and our partners at Enterprise Community Partners and the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel released a new report exploring 3 effective policy solutions that cities can adopt to help address local housing challenges. Today, we're pleased to be joined by Enterprise Community Partners to talk about 2 of these policies: affordable housing trusts and healthy rental housing. But before we dive in, I'd like to introduce CityHealth to those of you who may be joining us for the very first time. CityHealth was founded in 2014 as a project of the de Beaumont Foundation, and our mission has always been to promote upstream health-related and equitable policy interventions in America's largest cities. In 2018, Kaiser Permanente, the nation's largest private integrated healthcare delivery system, joined the de Beaumont Foundation as CityHealth's national partner. CityHealth works to advance a package of policy solutions that have a track record of having bipartisan support and can result in positive health outcomes for individuals and communities. Each year, we assess the nation's largest cities on our policies, and we award a gold, silver, or bronze or no medal based on the strength and number of policies that cities have in place. Our very first package of policies featured 9 specific policy interventions, and we assessed 40 of the nation's top largest cities across those different policies. Starting this year, we've adopted a new 2.0 policy package. This is what you actually see on your screen right now. And we now feature 12 policies, and we're expanding the number of cities that we work with to 75. We work with a number of fantastic subject matter experts, and these folks provide direct technical assistance and implementation support to the cities that we partner directly with. We are very proud to work with Enterprise Community Partners on affordable housing trusts and healthy rental housing, which we'll be discussing today. We hope you can join us on September 8th to explore our 3rd policy in our latest report: legal support for renters with the National Coalition for a Civil Right to Counsel. I will now turn it over to Bithany Ratznami with Enterprise. Bithya?
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be with you today. Catherine said my name is Bithya Ratnaswamy, and I am really honored to be the Director of Equitable Housing Solutions at Enterprise Advisors, which is housed within Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise Advisors is Enterprise Community Partners' nonprofit mission-driven consulting arm that exists to support communities across the country who are working to address their housing affordability and community development goals. Today, we are excited to be partnering with CityHealth to talk about 2 important topics: affordable housing trusts and healthy rental housing policies. But before we jump into those policies, we're going to take a step back and think about housing affordability and accessibility at large. Next slide, please. Before we do that, just wanted to take a moment and pause. I'd love for each of you to think about what your home means to you, whether that's an apartment like my studio I'm sitting in today, or a single family home. What does it mean to you? How does it make you feel? And why is it so important? As I've asked this question to communities and residents across the country, I've gotten lots of different answers. It's a place of safety. It's the place I can be myself. It's the place I go at the end of the day when the rest of the world feels chaotic. It's the place I can connect with my kids and my family and other loved ones. It's my place in the universe. Others have shared that they think about home as their community, the neighborhood that they live in. It's their front porches, it's the sidewalks. All of these places together are what make home for them. So I just encourage you to keep that in mind as we have this conversation today. With that in mind, we know that those words don't resonate with everybody. For some places, home is hard. Home is unsafe. It's a stressful environment. It's not somewhere that feels good to people. And our goal is to make home a place of power and belonging for everybody here at Enterprise. We know that more than ever before, cities across the country are being faced with housing challenges. The pandemic just exacerbated issues that have been lying beneath the surface and that many of our residents have known about and experienced firsthand for generations. But we're not defined by these challenges that we face. Leaders like you across the country have the opportunity to act today with intentionality and strategy as we think about the present of our current residents, as well as the long-term futures of our community. So I encourage you to think about this as we talk both about affordable housing trusts and healthy rental housing policies, what the opportunity is that we have today. Next slide, please. The challenges can be many. I'm sure each of you have experienced either firsthand or just from listening to your residents about the rising costs of both housing and development. In this graphic here from Harvard's Joint Center on Housing Studies, we see that since 2004 to 2022, housing prices for both homes and for apartments have been jumping all over the place. But in these last few years, it has been a steady uphill rise. So we know incomes have not matched that. And so therein is a major problem. We also know homes across the country are aging. While many new luxury apartments are being created and new single family homes are, we also know we have an aging housing stock. And with age comes different challenges. Repairs, rehabilitations are needed. And at the same time, studies have showed that low income homeowners have the least resources available to make those changes that they need to in their properties. We've also seen how much changes at federal leadership can impact what communities are able to do on the ground if cities don't have their own local resources in place. We've seen ups and downs with federal spending allocations for HUD. We've seen policy changes that impact residents' rights and protections. We've seen different messaging come out of different leaders. And so it's important that local leaders are able to provide steady resources and protections for renters and homeowners. And finally, at a local level, we're seeing different mismatches in the housing stock that exists, as well as the people who live in their communities and in their regions. And I'm not going to make any blanket statement here because all different cities have different realities on the ground, but differences in household sizes. We're seeing some households get smaller, also growth in higher size families. We know income inequality is a challenge that many cities are being faced with the growing gap between those who do not have resources and those who do, and also a graying population, recognizing the need for housing to accommodate those who are older and might need different housing than they previously needed, and what it looks like to ensure that we have a safe, accessible stock for them. Next slide, please. We know we didn't get to where we are today without intentionality of those before us. And I'm going to talk about every single one of these lines on these next two slides, but we know that the actions of those in the past have an impact on us today still. So everything from slavery to Jim Crow laws being in place, segregation being perpetuated through policy, restrictive covenants, redlining, blockbusting, a lot of topics that many of us have really engaged with deeply over the last few years or are learning about today. Next slide. The story has continued since the 30s. We know that urban renewal and suburbanization have impacted our city centers. We also know that the Fair Housing Act and Civil Rights Act and many other policies of the 60s have started paving a new way for today. But yet there's still challenges. And today, the Black home ownership rate is actually at a 50-year low, and that we are faced with the reality of the racial wealth gap. So the highs and lows of the last hundreds of years put us today. Next slide, please. We know that there are still racial inequities that are impossible to ignore. This slide shows what the cost burdens are amongst both renters and homeowners. So cost burden means how much you are spending on your housing relative to your income. HUD considers a housing cost burden to be any household that is spending more than 30% of their income on their housing expenses. So if you're spending more than 30%, you are considered moderately cost burdened by HUD. And so this looks at the difference between renters and homeowners. We know that those who are homeowners are more likely to be cost burdened than those who are homeowners. You see when it's broken down by income, those with household incomes of less than 30,000 are significantly higher cost burden rates than those with incomes of greater than 75,000 and over. And then of course, along race lines, there's also disparities, with the highest housing cost burden rate being those who identify as Black, and the lowest cost burden being seen in households, head of households who identify as white. So recognizing this, we know this isn't isolated to any one geography anymore. Tom, if you could go to the next slide. This is not a coastal issue anymore, as people once thought it was. I am from the Midwest myself, but have spent most of my career working in the Sun Belt, but we see this issue isn't a coastal issue anymore. Just looking at rents between 2021 and 2022, rents in most major markets have increased by double digits. So not only are there hotspots like Phoenix and Florida, Atlanta, we're seeing this change also in the Midwest, in these sections of the country that haven't previously been faced with this particular challenge. So we know this is something that really impacts all of us. And this is just looking at urban centers. With that being said, I am going to pass the mic to my colleague Jared to talk about affordable housing trusts, which is a local tool that cities can employ to address these challenges and really seize the opportunity.
Thank you, Bithia. My name is Jared Smith. I'm the program director for the Equitable Housing Solutions team within Enterprise Advisors, and thank you all for joining us today. So we're going to talk a little bit about what affordable housing trusts are. Next slide, please. So an affordable housing trust is a fund that is dedicated for affordable housing and created at the local, county, and or state level. And the key word here is that it's a dedicated fund to affordable housing, meaning there's a reliable source of funds specifically allocated to meeting your community's affordable housing needs. And another important thing to note is that it can happen at multiple levels of government, hence the and or in this definition. Next slide, please. So the primary benefits of affordable housing trusts, first and foremost, as I said, is it's a dependable source of funds. Unlike federal or state or private dollars, which can come with stringent regulations, policymakers and local leaders know that this is a resource that can be counted on and pointed towards as a tool to promote healthy, affordable housing. They also offer flexibility to address housing needs and opportunities. As one big example, I don't think any of us saw the pandemic coming or how it would affect local housing markets, but affordable housing trusts offer an opportunity to respond rapidly to changing conditions and seize on new opportunities. They also can have broad applications to support housing-related programs. The funds can be used for more than just preserving or building new affordable housing, but can be used for down payment assistance, or legal assistance programs for renters. They also increase access to capital. And this is absolutely crucial because, as we all know, grants and loans are limited and a competitive resource. And it can be especially challenging for nonprofit affordable housing developers who often have a much more difficult time accessing capital than their for-profit counterparts. It also demonstrates a clear commitment to both the public and private partners and can signal a catalyst for additional support and collaboration when it comes to supporting healthy, affordable housing. Next slide, please. So some potential uses for affordable housing trusts, obviously they can directly increase the number of rental and for sale affordable housing options, but they can also finance loans and grants for home repairs, for rehab projects of existing homes, which of course is oftentimes much cheaper than building new affordable housing. They can also acquire affordable housing or mixed income housing, perhaps targeted at affordable at units that are seeing affordability restrictions that are soon going to expire, or in neighborhoods that are on the cusp of becoming unaffordable. They can also provide resources for other programs that help promote healthy and housing stability. Next slide, please. So, of course, everyone wants to know what are some potential ways that we can finance these affordable housing trusts. Well, first and foremost, there's linkage fees. So similar to impact fees, where fees are assessed based on new construction's impact on a local market, a linkage fee can be assessed and deposited into an affordable housing trust. Of course, there's also recordation and deed fees are used pretty commonly. A new one is short-term rental fees. In other words, Airbnb or Vrbo units that often raise nearby home prices and remove a rental option from the marketplace. There can be a fee assessed against them. There's, of course, property tax levies, parking taxes as well. You can dedicate appropriations from the general fund or elsewhere. But the point is that there's a lot of potential sources available to finance affordable housing trusts. And I challenge you to think outside of the box in terms of what can be done to finance these trusts. Next slide, please. So some critical considerations to keep in mind before creating or modernizing an affordable housing trust policy. It's important to understand the community's housing needs, the gaps that exist in the local housing finance ecosystem, the local and state enabling environment, et cetera. But these are kind of the 7 big areas of consideration that the report goes into much greater detail about. I also just want to point out that obviously many of us probably think that funding and community engagement are the most important elements, and in many ways that's true, but really all of these are equally important when it comes to designing the right affordable housing trust for your community and making sure that it functions well. Next slide, please. So let's look at CityHealth metal criteria. So in order to be considered for a bronze, first and foremost, you need to establish a fund. I think that should make some pretty intuitive sense. But on top of that, the fund needs to have a multi-stakeholder oversight board, preferably one that's reflective of the community that it's serving. In order to get a silver medal, there's the added layer of identifying a dedicated revenue source. But then in order to get a gold, the additional layer there is that it has to be a recurring revenue source, like a tax, whereas a bond, for instance, is not recurring. It's a one-time injection into the affordable housing trust and would be considered more of a silver level revenue source. But on top of that, in order to earn a gold, there also needs to be specifically identified affordability levels, and there needs to be some kind of regular evaluation and public reporting to ensure that the funds are being used efficiently and being targeted appropriately. Next slide, please. So let's look very quickly at one of these medals in practice, the Denver's Affordable Housing Fund. I won't speak about this too much because one of our panelists, Laura Brudzynski, is immeasurably more familiar with it than I am. But I wanted to highlight Denver because it has an exceptional affordable housing trust and serves as an example for other cities to follow. First and foremost, they meet the bronze criteria. It was established in 2016, and they have a multi-stakeholder oversight board in the form of the Housing Stability Strategic Advisors Group. But it also meets the gold criteria. Not only does it have a dedicated revenue source, and not only is that source of revenue recurring, but Denver's Affordable Housing Trust has multiple recurring revenue sources. They really thought outside of the box, and it really helps to ensure that their affordable housing trust remains funded. Additionally, they identified affordability levels, specifically those making less than 120% AMI, and it has a regular evaluation and public reporting element in the form of Affordable Housing Fund Policy Review that's published. And so with that, I'll hand it back over to Bithya.
Thank you, Jara. Next slide, please. The healthy rental housing policies are complementary tools to affordable housing trusts. We really think about these as part of a bigger toolkit that cities can employ to address housing challenges. The home's conditions and how it's maintained really connects to household health. And so with that, code enforcement is something to really think about strategically. Traditionally, cities have enforced housing codes through complaint-based systems where local housing enforcement reacts to complaints. However, healthy rental housing or proactive rental inspections are, just as the name implied, proactive. So periodic inspections of rental policies rather than simply reactive report-based policies. The objective is to overall improve the quality of rental housing stock and shifts the burden, most importantly, from residents who often fear retaliation if reporting housing issues. These policies also create clear expectations for landlords and property managers to set the bar for the stock of housing that they manage. Next slide, please. We know that there are a number of health-related aspects of housing, including but not limited to the presence of pests, the presence of mold, the quality of ventilation in a home, and chemicals being present in a home, including lead. About 23 million housing units, including homeowner-occupied housing, have lead-based paints, including 3.6 million where children live under the age of 6. We know that there are many consequences of living in homes with lead and other dangerous chemicals in their homes. We also know that unsafe conditions can create health risks for residents. For residents, hazards in homes can lead to increased emergency room visits, as well as higher mortality rates. Older people are also more vulnerable to temperature extremes, so if there's not air conditioning or heating that's up to code, that can pose major challenges for residents as well. Next slide, please. Thinking about why healthy rental housing policies are so important, first and foremost, it protects renters who are most vulnerable to unhealthy living conditions. So by cities proactively conducting inspections and identifying issues, this creates more accountability for landlords to address these issues, and again, takes that fear of retaliation away from residents. By improving the overall housing stock, it also creates stronger neighborhoods and reduces the need for residents to move from one home to another if the home that they're living in meets their needs. Most importantly, this is a solution-oriented policy. So one that really gets onto the ground, looks at the issues at hand, and helps residents live in healthier spaces. Next slide, please. There are many critical considerations for policymakers to keep in mind when developing healthy rental housing policies. One, there are possible unintended consequences. For example, if an inspector finds a major issue and deems the home uninhabitable, what does that mean for the current resident? Do they have somewhere to go? Are there resources in place for them to relocate? The list goes on. So making sure that these unintended consequences are kept in mind at the forefront and solutions are created to address those. Cities should also consider who should be included under a proactive healthy rental housing policy. Is it all rental units? Is it multifamily? Really understanding the stock and making those determinations. Also, having a rental registry in place is key. So understanding what's needed for a city to manage that registry. When it comes to the implementation side, funding is key. So understanding how are we going to pay for this many inspectors to do proactive inspections? Where is that money coming from? How are the funds used? The list goes on. Also, how the policy is developed is key. Is it being done with residents? Is it being done with property managers only? Who's at the table, and how can you make that an inclusive discussion? Administration and enforcement are also key considerations. What body is set up well to do this? What resources do they need? And what does enforcement and compliance look like in a way that is about restoration at the end of the day and not about punishment, but ultimately getting wrongs righted? And then finally, oversight and accountability, making sure there's structures in place to keep the policy fresh, make sure it's as effective as it needs to be, and that resources are being used well. Next slide, please. The middle criteria for CityHealth is here on the slide. It's also found in the report, touches on many of the topics that we've talked through today, so I'm not going to go into these line by line. But the spirit of this is, as a foundation, having a strong rental registry in place that requires property owners to register their properties with cities. Governments, the silver medal is introducing periodic, really routine inspections that are conducted at least once every 10 years that really outline what is required as part of those inspections, including notice. And then the gold medal is the same as silver, but hiring the bar and having rental inspections conducted at least once every 5 years, as well as required inspection or registration fees and evaluation or reporting requirements. The exemplary city we wanted to highlight today is Boston, whose policy is very clearly written. Next slide, please. And requires that all units be registered with the city, includes coordination with other agencies that manage housing, including the Boston Housing Authority, requires inspections at least once every 5 years, but also requires even more for problem properties, and has a strong reporting component that increases accountability for landlords. And with that, I am going to open up the Q&A. I'm seeing our first question in here. Inspections being established every 5 to 10 years. How were those timelines established? CityHealth colleagues, I would love for you to jump in here. But the idea was to make this accessible to communities. We know that cities do go above and beyond that, but setting a baseline to really start the conversation was absolutely key.
But yeah, I can also chime in here. We also take under account what cities are doing. Where are cities? What's happening? One of the things that we have incorporated in the selection of both the policies and the criteria is, does it exist somewhere? Has it been tested? Has it been tried? And so, yes, absolutely here, some criticism about the length and that it might be too much time in between, but we also have to start somewhere and build upon what is already happening within communities. So yes, Bethy, I totally agree with you, in consultation with communities, but also really looking at where cities are and where we want to kind of meet them and then help push them a bit. Katrina, I don't know if you want to add anything there.
Yes. The other thing that I would add is just the expense. So having to actually do the enforcement and inspection of every unit takes manpower and it takes dollars. And so we also wanted to just recognize where cities might be in time and space and what resources were available to actually conduct those inspections of all of their rental properties.
I'm not seeing any other questions drop in the chat right now, so I'm going to turn it to Katrina to start our panel.
Thank you, Vidya. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Katrina Forrest, and I'm one of the co-executive directors of CityHealth. I am incredibly excited to kick off today's panel discussion. But first, I do want to thank Vidya and Jara for their presentations. The data and evidence are clear that affordable housing trusts and healthy rental housing policies, these local solutions, can effectively increase access to affordable housing. They can address housing conditions, and ultimately they can work to improve overall health. So thank you both so much once again for your incredibly thoughtful and detailed presentations. You all have already heard from the wonderful Vidya. She is the Director of Equitable Housing Solutions with Enterprise Advisors. As she mentioned, that is part of Enterprise Community Partners. And so I'm thrilled to have her participate in this discussion as well. I am also honored to be joined by Laura Brudzynski, who serves as the Deputy Director of Operations for the Department of Housing Stability at the City and County of Denver, Colorado. In this role, she directs the department's work to manage a $270 million housing and homelessness budget. She guides public policy and strategic initiatives, and she's working to ensure that the department's services are informed by community input and equitably serve the needs of her residents. Finally, I am excited to introduce our last panelist, Mary Ayala. Mary serves as the Senior Program Director for National Initiatives with Enterprise Community Partners, where she is a leader on Enterprise's Health and Housing National Program. This is a program that works to facilitate innovative partnerships and models across to address housing as well, to address housing as a health solution in community development, healthcare, and public health. This is an incredibly dynamic panel, and I want to thank you all so much for joining today. With that, I am going to dive right into my very first question. And this is a question for all of the panelists. And Laura, I will kick it to you to start us off, but definitely want to hear from all of you. Affordable housing conversations in this country are often mired in a discussion about economics, right? You have developers thinking about how to make the financing work, municipalities grappling with how deeply to subsidize a project or what incentives they need to offer to see that a project is completed. But at the core, housing, or the lack thereof, is a human experience. How do we balance the very real challenge of funding with centering people and ensuring that we are building the kinds of communities that serve everyone?
Thank you so much, Katrina. I would be happy to kick us off and look forward to turning this to other panelists as well. I'm Laura Brudzynski, as Katrina introduced. For those who may not know the city of Denver, we have a population of about 700,000, and 1 in 3 households within the city of Denver are cost burdened, meaning they're paying more than 30% of their income towards housing costs. It has been an honor to be a part of the steps that Denver has taken over the last decade to really invest into this growing need for affordable housing. Housing is the foundation that all of the other components of opportunity, that health is built upon. And so we know, you can hear I was introduced as part of the Department of Housing Stability, that housing stability is the foundation. Housing is healthcare. And so I want to highlight, and I certainly can talk a little bit more about this as we go through the panel, that we heard in many engagement opportunities from our residents from the early 2000s through the development of multiple plan processes that affordable housing and a dedicated source of affordable housing was critical as a policy tool within our toolbox to create, preserve, support programs that help serve those who are in need of housing stability. So Denver's Affordable Housing Fund, which is about it started as a $15 million per year fund when it was adopted in 2016. It is now more than $30 million, was the first critical step that we took towards dedicating local resources towards affordable housing. Since then, we've taken other steps as well. We have added another fund towards homelessness resolution, utilized general obligation bonds, but really that critical step of listening to the community, evaluating our data on what need was, and taking the steps to seed that fund that has just grown over time were critical in responding to and serving those in our need with housing stability. So it is an honor to be part of this panel. Look forward to digging in more, but just wanted to kick us off with a little introduction to Denver.
That's fantastic, Laura, and I'm thrilled to hear about the community engagement. I definitely want to come back to that. The other thing, Jared teed up this conversation, how innovatively you guys have thought about your funding sources. Also want to come back around to that. But I do, again, want to pull Bithya and Mary into the discussion as well. So I'd love to hear from you guys. How do we center people and not have them be a math equation? The funding it's a real challenge, but these are people's lives. And Bithya, I loved how you talked about it's our home and what that actually means. So I'd love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, I totally echo Laura's sentiment on listening. Listening is key, and doing something meaningful with that. Recognizing there's no one silver bullet to addressing this challenge. Local funding is critical, but we also need rights. We also need protections. We also need tools that work for development partners. And so listening to residents first and foremost, but also hearing from development partners and those who are interacting with the funds to make sure that they're usable, deployable, and really make sense with other tools that exist. Really thinking about tailored solution, recognizing that what might work in Boston isn't necessarily going to work in Des Moines, or even what works in LA isn't necessarily going to work in San Francisco. And so really thinking about your local context, your local residents and their needs, and really creating tailored solutions to address the challenges. And really thinking about it from a structural point too. So knowing that like we talked about earlier, where we are where we are today because of where we've been. And so really being intentional about what we want the future to look like and not to just reinforce the status quo.
I love that. Mary, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'd love to build on that with a few examples. So in a lot of the work that I do with Enterprise, we work directly with developers around the affordable housing developments that they're building. And we often try to tie it in with different funding opportunities as well. So we, just to reiterate what's already been said, yes, let's talk to the community, you know, let's talk to the residents as often and as early as we possibly can. What we've found through our work is the earlier you can start that engagement, the less expensive it's going to be to incorporate their needs and their priorities, and it helps you better understand where to prioritize the funds. When you're looking at something like health or sustainability or resilience, understanding the needs that are on the ground allows you to then say, okay, this is going to be our highest priority, and then work down from there. So we often have partners kind of come to us and want go-to checklists of like, what are the healthy housing solutions we can integrate into our work? And as often as possible, we try to meet kind of their timeline and their budget and scale to an engagement strategy. So we have something called the Health Action Plan, which is a little bit more intense and can take 3 to 6 months to prioritize health within your development. But we also have tools around charrettes and just inviting key community members, and it can take less than a day to start to develop those ideas and priorities. So to the point of today's event as well is how can we integrate that into policy and financing? And I think keeping in mind that this engagement does sometimes cost money, or oftentimes cost money, and that you need to pay residents for their time or pay community members as often as possible for their time, and that it can, to do it well, take time. So where you can build that into qualified allocation plans or the financing mechanisms that you have, all the better. And so in 2019, we launched our Housing for Health Fund with Kaiser Permanente. It's just an example of an affordable preservation fund that builds in the funding to actually perform a health action plan so that that burden isn't on the developer, but it's incorporated into the returns that come out of the investment made into the fund. And with that, we've been able to work with developers to really prioritize things like resident safety or asthma and respiratory health with low cost opportunities, and really helping them decide where they're going to spend their limited budget related to health and housing.
I love all of that. And I appreciate that you all have emphasized the importance of community engagement and active listening. I think that is critical. I think sometimes where the community is often left wanting more is when they have said what they need and those needs have been prioritized, but they're actually not seeing the dollars follow what they have said. So I do want to get kind of into the specifics and mechanics of Denver's Affordable Housing Trust. Obviously, one of the benefits of a trust is its flexibility, flexible in the types of needs that are met or served by the trust. Laura, what are some of the initiatives that Denver's Affordable Housing Trust funds actually support, and how do you and your team target those programs to those who most need them?
It's a great question. So I mentioned that Denver's Affordable Housing Fund was adopted in 2016. We did a lot of listening in the process to develop the fund and in the process to create. One of the things that's required in our ordinance that created the fund is a strategic plan that directs the spending of those resources. So we have a 3 to 5 year strategic plan and then annual action plans where we go back and talk with community about how to prioritize resources in a given year to help implement the goals that are outlined in that strategic plan. And so as you highlight, the benefit of local funds is that they can be used more nimbly, more flexibly to respond to needs compared to federal funds which come with just more restrictions. So as we were listening to residents in the development of the fund, the development of that strategic plan, we heard from residents, just as one example of something that they felt like they needed a tool that wasn't in our toolbox at that point, which was just a little bit of rental or utility assistance to keep them stably housed in the home that they were already living in. A few $100s that helped them be able to pay rent and a medical bill as a programmatic intervention, just as an example. We launched in 2017 our temporary rental and utility assistance program that served between 400 and 700 households each year with that kind of intervention that our local trust fund helped us serve a need in the community that wasn't being served. We now have federal resources that are helping, but that local fund seeding that source, that program helped us be ready for those federal funds with partners here locally who could administer those dollars and an infrastructure for our investment. So that's one innovative tool that came from community that a local funding source was able to more nimbly respond to that need compared to other tools in our toolbox at the time. The other thing that I would highlight is that in our really engagement to create a strategic plan for the expenditure of our local resources, and actually our local resources, our plans cover all resources. So when community gives us feedback about local resources, they're also giving us feedback about federal resources. And we take all of those things into consideration together. They gave us feedback that they really wanted to see our programs and our development reach the lowest income levels, those who are earning below 30% of the area median income and those who are experiencing homelessness. That's where our biggest needs are. And so seeing those new resources, around 50% of our new resources were helping to serve those at the lowest income levels. And that request came from community and responded to the data that we saw as a need. So they also really asked us to focus on programs, yes, like that rent and utility assistance, but they also wanted us to focus on the home and the affordability of the home that stays affordable for the long term. Here in Denver, we're required by policy to keep our affordable homes affordable for at least 60 years. Many times it's 99 years or more that the home is affordable for. So the majority of our resources are actually spent towards development and preservation of affordable housing, both rental and for sale. And it's complemented by programs like that innovative rent and utility assistance I mentioned earlier. But really our focus has been primarily on the unit development to keep that home available for households for many years and generations to come. So we have already created about 4,000 affordable homes since the investment of this fund started back in 2017. About $125 million have been spent from that fund in total for programs and development. So we are really, really honored and excited to be able to continue investing this resource to continue providing the homes, the programmatic assistance that our community has given us feedback and driven us to help inform how those priorities are set.
I don't even know what to say. Kudos to the city of Denver. I mean, you guys, what you have done is absolutely incredible. The commitment to listening to the community and then being innovative in how those dollars are deployed, the rent and utility assistance that you've created 4,000 affordable units, and they will be affordable in perpetuity or for quite a long time. Like, that is extraordinary. So congratulations to you all on all of your work there. I also appreciate you talking about the importance of the local funds and how they sort of seeded everything else, and now you're better able to leverage the federal dollars. So I want to get into the funding and the funding sources. Many municipalities actually already have housing trust funds, but a common question or barrier is, particularly a barrier to successful implementation, is the funding piece. What are the appropriate funding sources? How can we pay for this? So I'm curious. I know that Denver's trust fund relies on property tax revenue coupled with a one-time fee on development. How did the city decide on those particular funding sources, and what advice would you offer to cities that are exploring these questions? And I have a follow-up for Vidya and Mary on that as well.
Sure, happy to talk to it. And certainly the earlier framing acknowledged one piece that I would anchor our exploration and our story in Denver in, which is that municipalities, states exploring the use of an affordable housing trust need to anchor first in what is the legal context for the opportunities, for the constraints that may be available to you in your state, in your jurisdiction, to help explore what the sources may be for your affordable housing trust exploration. So in Colorado, we have a combination of state restrictions that just create some barriers to retaining all of the revenue collected from taxes at the local level, and requires that any new tax be approved by the voters. So in Denver, as we were exploring a whole range of possible funding sources, we looked at the gamut of what was a possibility for us, those that would require voter approval, as well as those that could be approved by our city council directly. We weighed the opportunity for different funding sources with the lens of a few different goals that I would give as framing and context. Considering sources that were closely tied to the need for affordable housing, really trying to balance the generation of revenue across residents, business owners, developers, so that we really had a community-wide contribution towards housing, because we know it's a community-wide need that needs community-wide solutions. And then finally, I would just add in that realm, really thinking as you look at sources, what you may need to mitigate for as far as the impact to low and moderate income households that the funding sources may impact and are also aiming to support. So we, as you alluded to, landed on 2 original sources that seeded our fund. We now have a few extra sources, but in 2016, our property tax and our per square foot development fee, linkage fee, ensured that we had such a wide range of contributors to that fund. Residents and businesses pay property taxes, developers who are generating a need for affordable housing with new development contribute through that per square foot fee. So it really broadened the participation in contributing toward the need with community-wide solutions. So I guess as far as advice that I would recommend consideration is bringing together the differing perspectives that help you analyze that legal context. Clearly articulate your goals that you want to explore different sources with the lens of how does equity fit into your exploration? How does growth and impact to your city over time impact your exploration? Analyze different funding sources against each other. How much money could be generated by different sources? What's the amount of time and effort that would take to adopt a source? How could it impact residents in your community? And then finally, I would just add that that first step to create an affordable housing fund is the seed. Getting started, taking a recommendation from a policy document on paper to an action helps you get the ball rolling. And you can always take that ball and move with it once it's rolling. But taking that action to get something started and make a local commitment to affordable housing is critical. So just a few framing thoughts as far as city exploration of these kinds of funds.
I think that's incredible. And Bithya and Mary, is there anything else in terms of other key considerations or pitfalls that cities should be aware of, in addition to understanding the legal context, making sure they're bringing together different perspectives, other considerations or pitfalls cities should be aware of?
I think Laura really covered the bases. I know once upon a time I was sitting in a position similar to hers, and we had frequent meetings with the law department, finance, transportation, planning, and so getting everybody around the same Zoom call to make sure there was clear communication across departments was absolutely critical, so that there wasn't he said, she said, and that everybody just was working from the same set of information. We also worked with the city's lobbyists at that point, since we recognized a lot of the options required state legislation. And so having an understanding of, is this something that's politically feasible too? It would be a lot of lost time if you created this perfect policy, but then at the end of the day, there were external factors that would potentially not allow you to move forward. So I think having just as clear of a picture as possible is something that I would recommend cities pursue as well.
We have 2 policies that we wanted to highlight today. So I'm going to take a hard pivot because I do want to make sure that we're able to get to some questions around healthy rental housing. Bithya, this question I'm actually going to bring to you. More than 44 million households in America rent their homes, and the data tells us that compared to homeowners, renters are more likely to encounter substandard housing conditions that adversely impact their health. How do healthy rental housing policies or proactive rental inspections help to mitigate these hazards?
Absolutely. We touched on this earlier, but really the large part is creating accountability for landlords. We know that there is a clear power dynamic between landlords and tenants, and there's a lot of fear of retribution or retaliation that a lot of tenants face. And so oftentimes people are afraid of reporting issues or requesting for additional support and having major issues resolved by involving a local government. And so this takes the onus off of residents purely and places some of that back on the landlords, recognizing there's accountability, inspections are coming, and not knowing necessarily when that inspection is going to happen. So it creates that sense of accountability for landlords. And it also creates really clear expectations. The city of Boston has a really strong checklist that they have on their website of when we're coming for an inspection, these are the things that we're looking at. Clear as day, it's not you have to go back and read the building code. You have to go look at health codes. It puts it all in one place of here's what an inspection involves, here's what you're holding you to. And this is what we expect. And then also setting the stage for what compliance looks like is key too. So setting clear solutions, resources in mind to really help solve the issues and not just identify them.
That's great. And the accountability piece is key. I actually want to ask this question to all of you. And this was a audience question from Adam Reichenberger, and I apologize if I butchered your last name. But Adam is asking, how are successful communities mitigating increases in rent that could come with a healthy housing standard? Many communities, naturally affordable housing is unhealthy, unfortunately. Does enforcing healthy rental housing codes lead to rent increases? Laura, what has been your experience in Denver? Have you seen that? And then Vidya and Mary, I'd love for you to respond, maybe with specific examples or anecdotally what you guys have seen.
Sure. Denver's actually in the process of launching what is a rental registry that was highlighted as a tool. So that is something that we are working to roll out in anticipation of having the kind of registry that lets us know, for a long time we knew where every short-term rental was within the city of Denver, but not where every long-term rental was. And so this rental registry helps us to ensure that we have that knowledge, that we have that communication with landlords and with tenants. A big part of the launch of our program here in Denver is ensuring that landlords and tenants know the resources that Bithya mentioned earlier to help them access the legal assistance they need to prevent an eviction, that access the rental assistance that they need. I'll let Bithya and Mary talk a little bit more about what they've seen in other cities since we're on the cusp of implementing this program, but just wanted to highlight that a big part as we see housing costs adjust and reflect the market is how we connect both affordable housing to the keeping the unit itself, expanding our stock of affordable housing available to residents available within the city, and then also the rental assistance that makes sure whether it's a voucher that's a tenant-based or unit-based voucher keeps the housing affordable to the individual household. So I'll let Bithya and Mary talk a little bit more about where they've seen examples in other communities as far as specific registry programs.
Sure, I'm happy to build off of one of the things, Bithya, that you mentioned at the end, and Laura, you're talking about kind of combining resources, and I think that just drives home that along with the kind of, if you want to say, stick of these code enforcements and more proactive policies, it's really important to have the carrots as well to help landlords and to help organizations meet those needs that you're seeing within rental housing. So We know that the impact of living in poor conditions is great. You know, it costs our healthcare industry, it costs public health. And for example, we're seeing or we saw through the COVID pandemic that counties with a higher percentage of households with poor housing conditions also had higher rates of mortality associated with COVID-19. And these are all costs to the systems. So I think where we can, tying in public health programs associated with healthy housing to improve asthma and respiratory health with, innovative financing mechanisms where other industries are interested in coming in. How can we bring these together to support having the opportunity to actually fund the healthy housing upgrades and not see that burden be taken on by residents? And there's a lot of great examples of once there is a structured fund with this very specific focus around the country, that healthcare and other players do come to the table to help support that innovation within their communities.
I would also feel that there is work being done around the preservation of small and medium multifamily properties that are naturally occurring affordable housing. A few years ago, Enterprise released Tipping the Scale, which is a toolkit specifically for Southeastern cities, but I think there's a lot of great resources in there for small and medium multifamily property owners who are looking to do those property repairs, but also not have to raise the rents and make units unaffordable for the current residents. There's also different policy interventions ranging from housing vouchers, rent control, resources that help residents stay where they are regardless of what their income, and make sure that they're paying a manageable level of rent.
That is all excellent advice. And in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap us up on this last question. Because proactive rental inspection programs are so multifaceted, they rely on accurate data, on what rental units even exist in the jurisdiction. Laura uplifted the fact that they have a rental registry. They rely on enforcement, good tracking and accountability on where the violations have occurred and how they've been resolved. It is multifaceted. There's a lot to consider here. What advice would you all give to cities looking to adopt comprehensive healthy rental housing policies? Are there certain lessons learned or pitfalls that they should avoid when designing strong, effective policy?
Happy to jump in here. If I was to boil it down to a few things, I would say just having resources to implement the policy. So it's one thing to have the policy on the book, but also understanding your cost to administer and setting your priorities if you don't have full funding. Making sure there's clear community education with both residents and landlords, creating complementary anti-retaliation policies so that in between inspections, if residents do still need to make complaints, that they have protections in place. And then to touch on that last question, having anti-displacement resources on hand. So making sure that there's funding for temporary housing while repairs are being made, as well as any relocation services that might come up if there are homes that are found to be uninhabitable or needing critical repairs made. So again, thinking about those unintended consequences up front and planning ahead to mitigate those. And then collecting data, to Katrina's point, making sure that there's strong data on hand. Boston has so much data available. There's been some really deep analyses done on response times, the amount of cases that are actually closed out and resolved. So with that data, there's been able to be a really clear picture painted of what does it look like for a policy to be on hand versus what are the resources, how are protocol being played out in implementation.
That's fantastic. And I see we are almost at time. So Laura and Mary, I'm sorry that we weren't able to pull you in at the end there, but this has been such an incredibly rich conversation. Home is where health is. And I think all of these interventions, we are working to provide cities an opportunity to work collaboratively with communities to address access to affordable housing, housing conditions, preserve their affordable housing stock, and you name it. And ultimately, in the spirit of improving health outcomes for everyone. So thank you guys so much again for taking the time. I am going to pass it to my colleague, Catherine.
Katrina, thank you so much. Thank you to Laura, Bithia, Mary. I mean, Katrina, you ended that beautifully, home is where health is. I really encourage all of you to go ahead, if you hadn't had a chance already, to download our report at cityhealth.org. This is where you can explore all of our local housing policy solutions. A recording of this webinar will be available on our website. Please feel free to share it with your colleagues and partners who were not able to be with us today. Please connect with us via social media to get all the latest on all of our policy solutions. And I just want to say thank you all for joining us and have a wonderful day.